This is a lecture on Patrick Deneen's essay on manners and morals, and what I'm going to do is highlight some of the key ideas in this to prime you for reading the article itself. And so what I want you to think about is what table manners have to do with virtue, with civilization, and with political discourse. That will help us get a sense of how this reading fits into our course. For a lot of us, manners don't really seem like they have any moral significance at all. At best, maybe they're supererogatory rather than obligatory. In other words, they're nice to have, to be considerate, courteous, polite, but they're not really necessary. At worst, manners maybe seem to be, for people who are trying to be all fancy, people who are snobbish or elitist. And this is especially true in American culture, where this sort of democratic ideal of equality suggests that it's better to be informal, casual, rather than giving in to empty formalities. That seems to be a very sort of American attitude of separating itself from the old formalities, old traditions of the old world, the aristocratic world. So the American vision, and Deneen talks about this in some American movies like The Princess Diaries, King Ralph. The idea is for Americans to show the rest of the world how to loosen up, how to relax and have a good time, rather than being so formal and uptight about things. Now, the question to ask is whether that's really all there is to manners. Deneen argues no. He actually wants to argue that by focusing especially on the phenomenon of the fork, that there's a close connection between manners, morals, and civilization, and even ultimately the highest aspirations of religion. He says that on page 37. The other thing to think about in thinking critically about impatience with manners that we find in American culture is, on the one hand, it's kind of a nice idea not to be elitist, not to be too formal, to be relaxed, to loosen up. But we might ask ourselves whether American culture escapes those old world emphases on status the way that we might think. You might think that you're not being snobbish, you're not being elitist by not sort of observing these manners or being ignorant of these manners. But at the same time, status seems to be a universal human phenomenon. Okay? It's just that it takes different forms in different cultures. So maybe it's not about, showing that you know which salad fork to use or when to bow and what the proper etiquette is in every situation. Status can manifest itself in other forms. And in American culture, that tends to be more in terms of the things that you buy, the things you own, clothes, possessions, cars, your house, or it can also be manifest in your accomplishments, so your career achievements, things like that. It can be in any number of subtle forms. So just because you get rid of more formal manners doesn't mean you get rid of the problem of status and elitism. So Deneen offers some definitions of manners throughout the article. So a few things that are worth highlighting. First of all, he talks about the relation between phusis and nomos, which we know from class is the distinction between nature and convention. So we might think of nature just sort of following our instincts, maybe doing what comes naturally, not following conventional forms, social forms, things like that. That would be more the domain of nomos, of law or convention. The problem is with the human being, we can't separate phusis and nomos so clearly as that. And so he follows Aristotle in arguing that we actually need nomos, we need convention in order to fulfill our nature as human beings. Because human beings have discourse, because we have logos, it's not enough for us just to live according to instinct. Instead, it's nomos that perfects, completes human nature. And those instincts actually need to be humanized. They need to be civilized, directed and mastered in such a way that it allows us to eat together and live together in a way that's uniquely human, rather than, say, just gathering around an animal carcass and tearing meat off with our teeth. And so, like virtue, manners are a kind of second nature. So there's the first nature, which is just instinct, appetite. But manners are similar to virtue in the sense that they're a new kind of nature, one that we acquire by virtue of our being social beings, political animals, through habituation. Aristotle describes manners as a kind of inscribed tradition involving practice and custom, and it's a conscious decision to ascend from brute appetite and to demonstrate that we're not slaves to our cravings, and that we can restrain ourselves and eat with consideration and respect for other people. Okay, so this has to do with mastering our appetites. On the top of 42, Deneen says that manners are conventions that shape and govern our nature. We don't cease to be creatures that must eat, but manners are a largely unconscious demonstration of our governance of our nature as eating creatures, even as we necessarily submit to and even engage in a more exalted practice of our nature. Far from being a troublesome and meaningless set of conventions, table manners are the daily manifestation of our commitment to the aspiration of human flourishing, of a realized humanity that ascends from mere or given humanity. To be a human is to be conventional, and among those most important conventions that express our humanity is to mediate, moderate, and master our appetites through the conventions at dinner time. So again, that's on page 42, and that passage bears reading carefully, making notes of those ideas that he's presenting. One example of this sort of mastery is the phenomenon of the fork. Now, you're probably all so used to using forks that you don't think about or don't remember how difficult it was to get used to using a fork, to be able to hold it in your hand, to balance it, to be able to use it effectively. When you were learning how to eat, it would have been a lot easier just to use your hands, to lift your bowl or your plate up to your face, or lower your face to the table and just shove all the food in like that. So the fork slows you down, and it's remarkably inefficient. And yet, that is precisely where it allows for this kind of mastery of instinct and appetite. Brings you into the human society of eating together at a table. So it slows the pace of eating, and it directs us to eat face to face, rather than lowering our face and shoving it into our food. So that's what helps us to forge community, to eat together in such a way that we're engaged in a social event, a social phenomenon when we share a meal like this. Okay, we're feeding ourselves not just to satiate an appetite, a need, but we're also entering into this life together. So you might consider the case of chopsticks as another example of this. Chopsticks are also a skill that requires care and attention and slows us down in a lot of ways. It'd be easier just to pick that roll up and shove it into your mouth. And yet chopsticks achieve a similar phenomenon of making eating social in this way. And so the fork is the phenomenon that Deneen focuses on, but we could also look at other examples. The way that we eat with chopsticks, or even if you've eaten food where you use bread as your utensil, right? Tearing off pieces of flat bread to pick up your food that way. That also involves a similar kind of custom that socializes the act of eating. Now, Deneen connects this then with larger questions of politics and of living together in a democratic society. Democracy especially needs manners because some of the other older forms that mediate our relations to each other are less prominent in a democracy. And so democracy itself is, in a sense, an elaborate form of table manners. It forces us, it requires us to slow down, to listen, and to think. So on page 53, he talks about how democracy like manners, democracy is not about convenience or efficiency. It might be more convenient and efficient if we had a tyrant who just decided to do whatever he wanted and we had to go along with it. If we have democratic forms, that makes things a lot less efficient, a lot less convenient. And yet those are the forms that allow us a greater degree of freedom and human flourishing. So these aren't about convenience or efficiency, they're about self-restraint and self-government, being willing to stop speaking and listen, to consider, to think carefully about other perspectives, and to incorporate those into the process of self-government. Self-government means for the community, but also as individuals. If we are going to live in a society that's able to govern itself, we as individuals also need to be able to govern ourselves individually, master ourselves, master our own appetites. So if citizens aren't able to govern themselves as individuals, that society also won't be able to govern itself as a society. So there's a connection there between individual and communal self-government. This is why we need the virtues that Deneen talks about on page 53, virtues of eloquence, clarity of thought and expression, and sound judgment. So if a democracy is going to thrive, if it's going to flourish, if it's even going to be possible, we need to cultivate those virtues. Again, of eloquence, being able to speak clearly, persuasively, clarity of thought, being able to think clearly and critically, as well as expressing our thoughts clearly and critically, and to exercise sound judgment, to be able to make prudent judgments about the best course of action, to be able to recognize foolishness for what it is, and to be able to pursue a course of wisdom. Those are things that philosophy in particular aims to cultivate in students and in citizens. Now, respect is also one of those virtues, and if you think about manners, they are a form of respect, of consideration for the others that we encounter. That's true at our dinner table when we're eating together. It's also true in society as we're trying to live together and work together. So we might be impatient with these forms of conduct, and yet it's precisely those things that help us to live together in a fully human way. We're more inclined toward things that are fast and easy and convenient. So Deneen talks about how this is true with food as well. We don't know where our food comes from a lot of the time, and we have a tendency to treat nature like a big filling station, he says. Thinking of nature as if it's just a natural resource that's there for us to use as much and as freely as we want, whenever we want, however we want. And not really appreciating what a fragile environment we have if we treat it that way. Now, in the same way, it's easy for us to take democracy for granted in that way and not to recognize what a fragile achievement democracy is, that it depends on these kinds of virtues. The same virtues we're talking about. Slowing down, listening, thinking, this sort of deliberation, the kind of respect that's necessary. And so this is why civil discourse matters. Why we need manners in order to communicate well and understand each other and pursue the best courses of action. So one of the things we'll be talking about next week, and we can discuss some of this in class as well, maybe how the internet threatens this kind of civil discourse, the kind of manners that make it possible for us to live together in this way. And also, our theme of next week will be the question of free speech. How manners, how virtue, how these things are related to the exercise of freedom of speech. So we will continue this discussion in class.